Hello, wider listeners. It is once again that time of the week. What time of the week is it? Well, it's that time of the week where we come onto your radio dial and we try to talk to you about what is really going on here in the city of Kalamazoo, state of Michigan, our country, and the whole wide world. We analyze issues from a deft, working-class lefty perspective. That's right, all of our commentators are sourced directly from the proletariat. And we call out the establishment on its BS and try to also kind of dig underneath the headlines, talk about stuff that the mainstream corporate media perhaps is not. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers, only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. As always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 WIDR or Western Michigan University, no matter how dope or insightful they may in fact turn out to be. So, flying solo on today's show, going to be going all live the next couple hours here, bringing you some really critical news updates. Per usual, I think we're going to start with the local stories and then build up from there. Make sure to keep your dial locked well into the 1 o'clock hour. Going to be doing a special segment talking about COVID, or specifically coronavirus criminals. We're going to be talking about the new book, how it relates to some individuals and corporations here in the state of Michigan. Right now, let's talk a little bit. There's this really great article from Now Kalamazoo that talks about some local political activity going on, particularly the Republican Party of Kalamazoo County. And I thought this was a notable story because often the way local politics gets framed here in Kalamazoo is that we are somehow above and apart from the more kind of rancorous national display of combative partisanship. Kalamazoo in particular has a very it has this thing about politeness. You know, everybody has to be very nice and polite. We're somehow like more friendly and well-mannered than some of the even last week we had that story about Lee Chatfield, who was going to take over Southwest Michigan First, and one of the things that people brought up to put pressure on Southwest Michigan First to unselect him was some of the kind of partisan rhetoric coming out of Lee Chatfield's Twitter box. But here's an important question. Misinformation, whether it's said politely or not, is still misinformation, is it not? And it looks like the Republican Party of Kalamazoo is engaging in some of that very same misinformation that is going on at the national level, particularly when it comes to elections and the state of election integrity. So I'm going to read a bit from this article here. It's written by Ben Lando and Dave Person, published on February 2nd. Article is headlined, Falsehoods Fuel Fear, underscoring Kalamazoo GOP's election strategy. The Kalamazoo GOP is using 2020 election misinformation to rally election inspectors for upcoming votes. There are no immediate problems to solve in Kalamazoo County's elections, but the local Republican Party is trying to recruit hundreds of election workers here by playing up falsehoods about fraud elsewhere in the state and around the country in the 2020 presidential election, exacerbating unfounded fears that it will happen in upcoming elections. The initiative is part of a calculated state and national strategy by the party, leaders of which led a summit on election integrity in Portage last week. That event included the Michigan GOP co-chair, who faces allegations of election fraud herself, which she claims was done at the behest of the Trump campaign itself. All allegations brought to court claiming President Trump won the 2020 election have been rejected by judges appointed by both major parties. Absent new evidence to support such allegations, repurposing the discredited claims further politicizes an election process that is intended to function as apolitical. Just a quick aside. So you've heard us talk about this on national stories. The reaction of Republicans to the previous election has really been twofold. One, pass as many and as much voter suppression legislation as possible, and try to install partisan election officials who ostensibly, they believe, could have the legal authority to overturn results. And they are, this is a strategy they are pursuing here at the local level in Kalamazoo, just FYI. And this article is going to talk about it a little bit more deeply here. The Republican Party is now taking aim at aspects of the election process, such as absentee voting and the regulations that election workers adhere to, further shaking confidence in the election process and inspiring more partisan workers to get involved. The state GOP, supported by the RNC, has created a centralized system that will field all applications for election inspectors instead of applicants submitting them to the municipal clerk's office. The RNC has also set up a hotline for reporting election day allegations. They hope to have 5,000 applicants statewide by May. So why this is important? So typically the people who file for those applications are the type of good Samaritans you see consistently manning voting booths and volunteering to do that kind of work year in and year out, your election cycle by election cycle. What the Republicans are trying to do is, it's a strategy of kind of just flooding the system with people who have a very overt loyalty to the Republican Party, and as I mentioned earlier, could be in a position to shift an election one way or another. Also, as this article goes in to talk about more, there is also the specter of election intimidation. So going on, so Matthew Seifried is the Michigan GOP's director of election integrity. He told the crowd that Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson didn't have the authority to mail out absentee ballot applications, and suggested that voting machines sent tabulations to other countries. Both of those things are false, and one of those I really want to put a fine point on. So alleging that Jocelyn Benson doesn't have the authority to mail out absentee ballot applications. Now, some of you may remember, about 4 years ago, 2018, there were some ballot initiatives that passed here in the state of Michigan. One was about gerrymandering. One, I'm sure a lot of you all know, is about legalizing marijuana. And then one was to improve voting access. And one of those things was no reason absentee ballots. So I find this allegation particularly nefarious because whether it was a Democrat or a Republican who would have won in that election, the Secretary of State would have been bound by that ballot measure, that ballot initiative, to make sure that absentee ballots, no reason absentee ballots, were available and sent out. And I should also mention, at the time, that particular ballot initiative was wildly popular and wildly popular among rank and file Democrats, Republicans, and independents. So again, it's a big shift in the way the GOP is trying to frame these issues, when just a couple of years ago their base, again, because it's a common sense thing, making it more convenient to vote. Most rank and file people will get behind something like that. But if you're in a position of power and your ideas are maybe waning in popularity, then it might be in your interest to make it more difficult to vote. We're going to take a quick little break. We will be right back. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org.
Wider FM is the student-run radio station at Western Michigan University. Along with the Western Herald and Western Herald Video, Wider is part of the WMU Student Media Group and is supported in part through generous donations from listeners like you. If you would like to join this list of generous donors, please click the donate button at widrfm.org and support our mission for radio evolution. The website once again, widrfm.org, on your radio at 89.1 Wider FM.
Hello, welcome back. This is Media Cyphers. So we're continuing to discuss this article about a recent meeting of the Kalamazoo GOP and how they are going full steam ahead with a lot of these misinformation strategies about election integrity. So going on, I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. Tony Lawrence, chairman of the Republican Party of Kalamazoo County, told Now Kalamazoo that there's no cause and effect to increasing the number of Republican Party election workers in the county, that there are no known problems with the local election results, nor is there an expectation of more Republican Party victories with more party workers on election day. It doesn't lead to anything. All we are looking for is fair, Lawrence said. I'm not saying anything about Kalamazoo County. This is a national issue. The new nationwide initiative being executed in Kalamazoo and elsewhere is not violating any law now that a 40-year-old consent decree has expired. Previously, the Republican Party had been restricted from recruiting certain Election Day operatives due to voter intimidation in a New Jersey governor's race in 1981. And I really want to hit on that, like the kind of wishy-washy response from Lawrence, Tony Lawrence, the chairman of Kalamazoo County's Republican Party, just kind of like vaguely gesturing at, it's like, well, we don't really think there's a problem, but at the same time, we're going to have these people from, national come down and tell everybody that the elections are rigged, and that's why they need to sign up. If the reason you are signing up is because you think that there's a nefarious plot to throw out Republican ballots or, Trump supporting ballots or something, then you're going to have a particular edge and agenda and a way of operating that is less than partial, especially when the basis for it is a lot of, cooked up nonsense. To be clear, I'm not trying to go to bat for the integrity of America's elections. I think, according to global study there, we've mentioned this on the program several times, we rank 41st in election integrity around the world. And there's a large number of reasons for that. But most of them boil down to the issues of money in politics, political corruption, things like gerrymandering. The actual election infrastructure basically favors, it favors the capitalist party. so it's important to understand. I think, much like many other problems in our time, there is a there, but when you don't have a grounded understanding of what is going on, what the corruption is, why it happens, you're going to end up coming up with some very interesting theories. You see this a lot with like the QAnon folks. They understand vaguely that there's like a ruling class, but instead of coming up with any sort of like rigorous analysis, it's, kind of a conspiracy theory boggle. And that's kind of similar to what's going on here, where, there's a lot of people who understand that our elections are rigged in favor of the rich, but again, without any grounded understanding of how politics works under capitalism, they're going to come up with some wonky theories. Anyway, going on. The Republicans' focus now is on recruiting election inspectors who are paid by local election authorities to help voters and process ballots, and poll watchers, also known as poll challengers, because, quote-unquote, Democrats continue their unconstitutional assault on our most basic voting protections, according to the RNC recruitment drive. And they really pull that rhetoric out of nowhere. Once again, just... the election, the way the election is rigged is like you get to choose between two billionaires with extremely similar politics, and you don't get to choose anything that you actually want. It's more like you get to choose what you dislike the least. And again, it's also a bit of that, accuse your opponent of that of which you are guilty, because to the Democrats' minimal credit, they are not rampaging through state legislatures trying to make it harder for people to vote. Anyway, the lack of election day staff makes it difficult for county clerks to create the partisan parity envisioned in state election law. The Lawrence said he hasn't seen any evidence of problems in Kalamazoo County elections. Again, I haven't seen any problems in our local elections, but there's this huge danger that our elections are going to be fraudulent. It's really speaking out of both sides of the mouth there. Going on to say, when asked whether the party is focused on election worker recruitment because of fears of systemic voter fraud or being outright cheated by the Democratic Party, Lawrence declined to provide details or specific examples of articles he claims illuminates the issue. This has been going on for 2 years, he said. I can't prove any of it, so I'm not going to say anything about it. You can't prove it because it's not true. Kalamazoo County's Republican Party has for months held regular, similarly focused informational sessions about election issues, though the summit last week appears to be a new phase of electoral engagement. In addition to Finlay and Cyphers, the event's promotional material featured two key speakers, both of whom have controversial histories with recent elections. One was Michigan GOP co-chair Meshin Maddock, who over the past few weeks has been exposed as one of 16 Michiganders who falsely claimed to be an elector and signed fake election certificates that were sent to the National Archive claiming that Trump won Michigan. This is part of an effort to influence Vice President Mike Pence to upend the congressional electoral certification process on January 6th. The Trump campaign asked us to do that under a lot of scrutiny for that today, Maddox said at a public event earlier in January organized by Stand Up Michigan, according to a recording obtained by CNN. Maddox gave the invocation and led the Pledge of Allegiance to launch the Kalamazoo GOP's event on January 25th, but didn't give a speech. When asked why the Kalamazoo County Republican Party featured a speaker at an election integrity summit who is actively being investigated for elections fraud, Lawrence said, "Because I don't believe she did it. The Democrats have been pumping this stuff out for years." He said people should focus more on Michigan Secretary of State Jocelyn Benson, who has, quote-unquote, broken more election laws than anyone I know. Which, again, he can't cite a single law that Jocelyn Benson has broken. So just to put a fine point on that. Also featured at the summit was Monica Palmer, executive director of the baseball-themed movement League of Our Own, who spoke about getting more women involved in politics. Palmer, a member of the Wayne County Board of Canvassers for the 2020 national election, initially opposed certification of that county's results, then voted to certify it, and then, following a call from Trump, attempted to rescind the certification. So, just an important reminder, again, everybody, politics happens at the local level, and that includes the sort of kind of corrupt misinformation, mudslinging politics we see at the national level, even whilst local party officials will try to be polite and sort of distance themselves from the most toxic or overt representations of what's going on. But make no mistake, they invited who they invited to this meeting. They are on board with this national strategy that, again, it takes advantage of the average, American citizen's distrust of the election system in favor of a party that is, plutocracy with some extra hot sauce, what am I saying? They Republicans don't like hot sauce. So I'm gonna get yelled at by some Republicans who like hot sauce. So let me just I meant that in the metaphorical way. They don't want their politics to be too spicy when it comes to things that might actually help everyday people. But yeah, it's important to track, again, this stuff going on right here in our backyard. And, call these people to task. They're very, again, like I said, they're part of the whole kind of Kalamazoo politeness. But there's nothing polite about spreading lies around and using it to score political points. All right, I think we're going to take a quick little break. When we come back, we'll switch gears and change up topics a little bit. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You also find us on Facebook, that's Media Cyphers, and YouTube. And check out our podcast on Podbean. We put together kind of a best of the radio show so you can listen to, download it on the internet. Y'all listening to Media Cyphers. Keep your dial locked. This is your only source for political revolution.
The Iron Temple. Every Monday night at 10 o'clock p.m. All the metal your heart desires awaits. Only on 89.1 FM WIDR Kalamazoo.
Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So next article we're going to talk about, just want to highlight some organizing going on the east side of the state and give a shout out to all the folks who are doing the good work tackling some environmental justice issues that are going on. This kind of ties in to the idea of sacrifice zones, particularly poor and oftentimes non-white neighborhoods. People have to deal with more industrial pollution. We see something like this going on in our backyard with the whole brouhaha going on with graphic packaging and all the nuisance odors that people on the north side have to experience, including all those strangely disproportionate incidences of asthma. But we've got some folks on the other side of the state that are speaking truth to power on a very similar issue. This article was published on February 4th. Headline is from MLive. Advocates call on Whitmer to take action on environmental justice issues. This is written by Ron Fonger. Activists in Flint, Benton Harbor, and Grand Rapids are calling on Governor Gretchen Whitmer to take further action on environmental and climate issues in the state, including a proposed asphalt plant that's been permitted. Excuse me. Sorry. Whoop. Sorry about that. Just a slight technical difficulty. Anyway, going on. Activists in Flint, Benton Harbor, and Grand Rapids are calling on the governor to take further action on environmental and climate issues in the state, including a proposed asphalt plant that's been permitted in the Flint area. The Coalition to Stop Ajax Asphalt Plant and the Grand Rapids Climate Coalition hosted a virtual news conference on Friday, February 4th, in response to Whitmer's State of the State address, which they said failed to focus attention on environmental hardships, including high lead levels of lead in Benton Harbor's water, and the permitting of an Ajax asphalt plant that's planning to operate just outside Flint in Genesee Township. These environmental injustices are still occurring, said Lashea Darasaw, a community organizer in Flint. What we would like to see from Governor Whitmer is for her to keep her promises and take action on environmental injustices and racism that's happening in our state. The Reverend Edward Pinkney of God's Household of Faith in Benton Harbor said Whitmer needs to make clear that residents there should not have to pay for water with elevated levels of lead. Benton Harbor residents petitioned the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency for help in September, and state officials have urged city residents to use bottled water for cooking, drinking, brushing teeth, rinsing food, and mixing baby formula. We also need you to come in and tell the residents in Benton Harbor that they will no longer need to be paying water bills until we get this right, Pinkney said on Friday. MLive, the Flint Journal, could not immediately reach a representative of the governor's office for comment on the news conference Friday. The Stop Ajax Coalition, which includes the St. Francis Prayer Center, had urged the State Department of Environmental, Great Lakes, and Energy not to issue an air permit allowing the asphalt plant to operate. EGLE issued the permit in November, but said the green light to operate came with a host of site-specific conditions and restrictions that provide safeguards to ensure compliance with the law, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Again, we have seen in really outrageous ways how the state will kind of look the other way in order to either help a corporation or, squeeze a little bit more money, even if it means poisoning people. The Flint City Council was called a special meeting on Wednesday, February 9th to hold a closed session to discuss the Ajax issue. Council members have said they are considering participating in a court appeal of the issuance of the company's air permit. So, again, I just wanted to highlight that, good work, the organizers of, kind of the Resist the Plant Coalition and the Coalition to Stop Ajax Asphalt Plant. And, this really does tie up several issues that are not really being properly addressed by the state government. And what's really sad to me is, as in a similar way, Biden was elected, not only as just like the anti-Trump, but there was an expectation that at least like some sweeping things need to be done in order to, make people satisfied with good governance, or at least like competent governance, I guess I should say. And as we talked on the show, we did an episode a couple weeks ago. It is the assessment of me and Lawrence that the Biden administration has largely pooped the bed on that. But we have also seen, I think in a significant way, the Gretchen Whitmer administration has been backstepping from its own campaign promises. Again, this is the first new government elected after the Flint water crisis, and if we recall, there's a lot of strong rhetoric about making sure these things don't happen again, and the inhumanity of allowing what happened in Flint to happen. At the same time, we're having these water issues going on in Benton Harbor. Very little has been done, and if you look closely at the issue, it's unfortunately a very familiar scene where we've got this very obvious problem, a health crisis, and the corporations and companies responsible are avoiding really any sort of accountability, and the governor and governor's office is really not doing anything about it. And a similar thing with these sacrifice zones. We had somebody who was very strong about shutting down Line 5, but how does it look when with one hand you talk a good game about shutting Line 5 down, You fight that in the courts, but you allow super polluters to operate in the backyards of poor and marginalized neighborhoods. And you don't fight against that, even rhetorically. And I think it's really a good, these activists are doing good work in really highlighting that, because I think, it's something that gets lost, especially in these last couple of years. Either a lot of people have come to defend Whitmer's administration and the way that they're handling of the coronavirus. A lot of their opponents, I say, like, most of the people I talk who loathe Gretchen Whitmer the most, usually it's for all the wrong reasons. Our main critique of the state of Michigan's COVID response was very similar to the American response. It was still very much based on listening to capital and taking notes from there. Even though maybe things didn't unlock as quickly as certain capitalists would have liked, it was still very much focused on how do we open up the economy as quickly as possible versus how do we prevent the most amount of deaths and infections. And these are not things that people forget. It's how it really is how some of the most reactionary candidates and Republicans get elected, because when you plant your base, when you need at least some marginalized people to vote for you, you need to do something for them. Otherwise, they will become dispirited. They will become apathetic about the political process, and rightfully so. Which again gives room for more reactionary figures to step in and get the votes of people who actively are voting and are usually afraid of made-up problems. So, yeah, it's the same kind of dichotomy. Of course, here it's not even asking for federal relief. It's asking, for, a bunch of toxic polluters to not be able to operate right down the street from where either like I live or where my kids play, etc., etc., etc. So again, tip of the hat to the folks who organized around this. We're going to take a quick little break. Come back. I think we're going to share a piece from the World Socialist website. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at WIDRFM.org, your only source for political revolution. There's a couple ways to check out the show. We've got a YouTube page. We upload full episodes of the program on there. So if you miss us on the radio, worry not. There is a public record of that. You can also find us on Facebook and check out our podcast on Podbean. We upload some of our best material there, and that's something you can, go there, download it on your phone, listen to us on the go. Anyway, we will be right back. This is Media Cyphers, your only source for political revolution.
Head on over to our website at widerfm.org.
Click on weekly newsletter tab.
Yes. The newsletter come out. I want to really read about all DJs, what they listen to, all these announcements.
You can also find an invite link to our Discord where we post updated information about upcoming shows, events, and all things wider.
It's very exciting. This has been a message from 89.1 Wider FM online at widrfm.org.
Hello, wider listeners. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. So this next piece I wanted to share with y'all talking about kind of labor rights and the intersection of labor rights and COVID-19. And I wanted to highlight this piece from the World Socialist website. They have activated an Inquest, which is to say they're basically doing a broad investigation, interviewing workers across the country, scientists, experts, talking about the way that, particularly in the United States, the working class has been abused and exposed to unnecessary death through the reckless and capitalistic policies that are active in the United States, and the incentives that would lead the ruling class to basically throw workers into the coronavirus volcano. Anyway, again, World Socialist website, they've been doing some really good COVID-19 coverage. Those who don't know, they do good journalism. It's a kind of Trotskyist media outlet, and they do a lot of local coverage. And in this one, they are it's some excerpts I'm going to be reading from an interview they did with Autoworker Randall James, who works in Ypsilanti, Michigan. So I'm going to go ahead and read from the article here. Randall's brother, Adam Williams, died of COVID in October 2021 when he was a worker at Michigan Manufacturing Incorporated in Saline, Michigan. Adam was mandated to work, meaning that he could be fired for refusing to work due to COVID-19 fears. As Randall explains, auto workers like himself and Adam were told they could protect themselves by wearing a mask of any kind, even ones made of cloth that actually do nothing to stop the spread of aerosol viruses like COVID-19. Tragically, Adam not only died, he brought the virus home, where it infected his 80-year-old grandmother, Annie, who was vaccinated. Adam was her sole caretaker. Annie now suffers from long COVID, depending on an oxygen tank to breathe, and lives with Randall and his family. Randall himself suffered a horrifying bout with COVID-19 at the Washtenaw County Jail. During his 14-day quarantine at the jail, he was held in inhuman conditions and medically mistreated as he became violently ill, and the virus infected, content warning, infected his testicles, which, man, the COVID can really do some nasty stuff. Anyway, prisoners, as Randall explains, were also given only cloth masks. Now, the principal of Henry Ford Early Learning Center in Ypsilanti, Michigan, has threatened that if Randall and his fiancée choose not to send their 5-year-old daughter to school, citing COVID-19 fears, they will face charges of truancy. Truancy charges can be fines, jail time, and even the removal of children from their home by Child Protective Services. And if you're especially thinking, like, just a few weeks ago when Omicron was surging, there were a lot of parents who were choosing to keep their kids home because of the potential dangers and exposures to the virus. And, you know, many children, again, are not vaccinated or protected at all. So, going on, Randall's story is shocking, but millions of workers and parents around the world are going through the same experience. And there's some highlights here from Randall's testimony. I'm just going to read some of these points. It's really wrenching stuff, but it's really important, I think, to share out there with folks. 1. Randall's brother Adam, also an auto worker, died from COVID-19 and infected his 80-year-old vaccinated grandmother. 2. Adam was under intense economic pressure to keep his job and provide for himself and his grandmother. And these are stories that we've been hearing since the start of the pandemic. The working class, the essential workers, were really put on the line, put on the sacrifice line. And it's an impossible choice, because to step out of the workforce would mean losing the income you need in order to keep your family afloat. We did have a short period during the pandemic where the government was actually offering some little substantive unemployment to fill the gap. But it was still a choice. A lot of working people, it was still an impossible choice for many working people. And as we've seen, the capitalist backlash to even getting some crumbs of a social safety net means in the future, workers are probably going to continue having this impossible decision to make. Number 3, in county jail, Randall himself caught COVID-19 and survived a harrowing ordeal as he was kept in isolation in inhuman conditions and denied medical treatment. Number 4, now a school principal is threatening Randall with truancy charges, which could mean fines, jail time, and even loss of custody for keeping his 5-year-old daughter out of school. So we just talked about that. Number 5, parents at school are being denied the right to view the conditions under which their children are being held. And I want to be very specific about that. Randall and his fiance said before COVID it was no problem. You could go in and sit all day, but now they don't want the parents to see. And, that comes from a couple of angles. One is just the understanding that if you are looking for, conditions that are unsafe due to COVID, you're probably going to find them if you step into a public school right now. Number 6, Randall supports a 2-month paid lockdown of schools and non-essential businesses to stop the pandemic and save lives. Randall goes on to say, China's got it all controlled. We have less people. We should be able to get it under control. I'm not into politics, but I know you're controlling me when you're making me send my daughter to school when there's a virus in that school. End quote. Number 7, the policy of herd immunity started under Trump and continued under Biden, and I would agree with their assessment of that, amounts to murder, Randall says. To quote, to infect the population and whoever is the strongest survives, that's murder. That's not fair. That's not giving children, the elderly, and the sick a chance. My brother had diabetes. Corona attacked his pancreas and he wasn't able to filter out his blood. Randall remembers Adam's painful last days and calls on workers to unite and fight against the pandemic. He goes on to say, just like a bullet, there is no name, face, it has no smell, taste, it comes at night, day, it's not fun to watch someone die of it. To all workers who watch this, please take this seriously and please unite. Again, very powerful testimony, and there's a full hour-long interview that they do with Randall James. You can find on their website. Again, it's published on January 26th, written by Tim Rivers and Zach Corrigan. It's on the World Socialist website. Summary and highlights from Inquest testimony of Michigan Autoworker Randall James. So we're going to take a quick little break, and when we come back, we've got some more. I think we're going to go continue talking about coronavirus, and particularly I'm going to talk a little bit about coronavirus criminals in this next bit. It's a really great book. We're going to read some excerpts from it. Well, actually, make some entire chapters. We're going to go in some deeper discussion. Might also touch on, and I was kind of on the fence about this because everybody's talking about this Joe Rogan nonsense, but I think it's worth bringing up for a couple of reasons, and I'll go into that as we get into the next part of the program. Keep your dial locked. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at WIDRFM.org. Remember, you can find us a couple of different ways. You can listen to our show every Tuesday from 12 p.m. to 2 p.m. But you can also find us on the internet. Subscribe to our YouTube page where we've put on all of our full radio episodes for your listening pleasure. You can follow us on Facebook, where we also share those, as well as memes, helpful reading suggestions, that sort of thing. And we also have a podcast. You can follow us on Podbean and most podcast apps, Media Cyphers Kalamazoo. And on there, we try to put together some of the best material we've produced on the show. And it's very easy. You can download it, listen to it while you're on the bus, heading to work, etc. Keep dialogued. We got more Media Cyphers on the way. This is Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR FM, your only source for political revolution. Hello, wider listeners. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR Kalamazoo. As always, the following thoughts, views, and opinions are not necessarily those of 89.1 WIDR or online at widrfm.org. So, in just a minute here, we're going to be doing a long-form segment talking about the book Coronavirus Criminals. Before that, though, I wanted to mention, and I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but so the whole Joe Rogan stuff that's recently been batting around online, national media is, again, it has gotten a lot of mainstream press coverage. And, of course, I'm referring to the whole situation where a couple of musicians were pulling their music off Spotify in response to some of the COVID-19 related information that was being broadcast on Joe Rogan's podcast, which they asserted as misinformation. And all the fallout from there. There also is the issue of him saying it's a bunch of racist stuff, which I'm not really going to touch on, except to say it's like, oh, I'm shocked. Oh, man. Just a couple of things, because again, like, this is something the mainstream media is focusing on. It's one of those culture war issues. It's one of those things that gets brought up to, hey, look at the shiny bauble, get mad about it, etc. At the end of the day, it's not that big of an issue, but it is something that people talk about. But there are a couple of things, kind of tertiary around the discourse that I thought. I think it's kind of important to bring up on the show, because there's certain things I was kind of alarmed by. And, one of them is the way a lot of, particularly like online people who use social media a lot, leftists were really coming on strong to try to defend Joe Rogan's podcast from quote-unquote censorship. And it's important because I think a lot of people don't understand the difference between, what's actually going on here, which is a boycott and censorship. So let's parse some things out. This response to say Joe Rogan is being censored. First of all, as of now, Spotify has not censored Joe Rogan's podcasts. Except, well, they've censored certain ones for a different reason related to him spouting the N-word. But when it comes to this COVID-related thing, nothing's actually been pulled down from Spotify. And the idea that a handful of musicians engaging in a boycott, because, like, that's what a boycott is. Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, a handful of others said, we are no longer going to use the services of Spotify. We are going to boycott them in response to some of the programming that you can find on Spotify, which is passing along COVID-related misinformation. Now, here's the thing. You can disagree with them for boycotting. You could say that's not a good reason to boycott, or there's a different way to solve this problem besides boycotting. But Neil Young, Joni Mitchell, etc., they are not censoring Joe Rogan. That is literally not what is happening. They are boycotting Spotify over Joe Rogan. And you can disagree with that. But there's this hysterical response from, well, you're not only right-wingers, but a lot of people on the left, that Joe Rogan is being quote-unquote censored when nothing of the sort is happening. It is not even the company itself that has talked about wanting Joe Rogan off their platform. And again, that's kind of how this stuff is supposed to work, isn't it? It's like, especially libertarians that talk about the free markets. Well, Neil Young, etc., are choosing not to freely associate with Spotify because of X, Y, and Z. I will say, to Joe Rogan's credit, even now he's in controversy, rightfully so, over, saying a bunch of racist stuff. He was at least a lot more mature about it than a lot of people you find online, saying, I will do better, I'll get, better information on my podcast, et cetera, et cetera. There is also this dubious idea of him being like, an anti-establishment voice, he's not a mainstream voice. It's like he's got 11 million plus subscribers. He's financially wealthy. He has corporate sponsors. I would go so far as to say that Joe Rogan probably is the mainstream media. He is part of the blob, so to speak. I think the most illuminating bit from this is the way people will hyperventilate over certain things without really understanding that, again, the power dynamics at play here are not what you think they are. People who are calling it state censorship. Last I checked, Neil Young is neither capitalism nor the state. He's a guy who wrote some good records, over his expansive lifetime, which you can't hear on Spotify right now. But, another thing that I think is important to highlight here is, while all of this controversy was going on, you have school boards and Republican legislatures across the country that are trying to ban books about LGBTQ rights, ban books that talk about the history of racism in this country. We just had what happened in Tennessee, where they removed Mouse from the curriculum, which is a very legendary graphic novel about the Holocaust. Yet some people are opting to spend time on the internet trying to, defend Joe Rogan's First Amendment rights, which again, were never at stake to begin with. And even if he had gotten deplatformed from Spotify, I don't know if y'all are aware, he's on literally every other platform. You can it takes mild inconvenience is not oppression. If you have to spend an extra 5 seconds looking up a Joe Rogan video on YouTube, you can. Also, I think a lot of people, it's interesting to me how the way this has been framed as a free speech thing. I'm in the corner, medical misinformation in particular is something that I think all of us should feel very strongly about. We should really look at it as should that be protected speech, or at the very least, and this is a case on my program, if I get something wrong, I have to make a retraction, and I have to make a correction, and I have to do that on air. I don't really see having someone else have that responsibility. That doesn't sound oppressive to me so much as it sounds like being a responsible adult. And again, at the end of the day, a lot of people are talking about this from just all the wrong angles, and decrying censorship when some very real censorship is going on exactly at this moment. But yes, God forbid, a few of our cherished folk musicians disagree with things like telling people to take ivermectin for COVID. Which actually brings me to just the last point I'd like to bring up. One of the things that I really didn't expect is there's a lot of people I noticed relitigating the idea of whether ivermectin should be used to treat COVID-19. And I thought, for the purpose of this program, it might be worth digging a little deeper into this. I want to give a shout out to Emily for helping with some of the research on this. But what it stems from, there are studies that showed ivermectin was effective against particular cells of COVID-19. That's important to point out with what I'm going to bring up here. So if you look at it from a broader, holistic perspective, it's still not a very good idea to use ivermectin to treat COVID in humans. So I'm going to try not to use too much dry medical terminology, but some of this is important. So ivermectin generally, they're a member in the class of avermectins. That's a highly active, broad-spectrum, like anti-parasitic. And one thing I do want to point is, like, yes, ivermectin is not only prescribed in horses. And what we saw last summer, and you can't necessarily blame Joe Rogan for people going out and buying horse paste, but basically it was the most, the horse medicine, the whole thing that happened last summer, it was the most commonly available type of ivermectin, but people weren't doing any sort of research into whether this was a legit treatment for COVID, whether there'd been more studies or data or how to use it as a treatment for COVID. And we're, again, taking excessive amounts of horse medicine. There are some cases people like going blind from it and stuff. But to be fair, not necessarily talking about it just being a medicine for horses. It's also an active ingredient, HeartGuard. A lot of y'all probably know that. You have deal with heartworms and stuff in dogs. But a lot of animals, including humans, there are certain people who have a mutation of the MDR1 gene, which blocks the production of P glycoprotein, which is a primary factor in the blood-brain barrier. The deletion of this protein allows drugs like ivermectin to pass into the brain and accumulate, causing neurotoxicity. Now, this is really important, and it's going to wrap up like why we shouldn't be actively pursuing this as a COVID treatment. So they studied this kind of gene mutation in mice. So they're using mice for the P glycoprotein encoding gene, displayed levels of ivermectin in the brain, which were 90 times greater than control mice. The mutation occurs not only in mice, but also dogs and also in humans. And there are no other symptoms of this mutation. Most people could have this sensitivity to ivermectin and would have no idea that they have it. Now, ivermectin toxicity and its side effects are irreversible. And some of the neurological effects reported in humans treated with ivermectin include confusion, encephalopathy, inability to walk, loss of consciousness, depressed levels of consciousness, tremor, vomiting, seizure or convulsion, coma, and even death. And it's also worth noting So there were the studies that pointed to ivermectin being effective against COVID cells. There's not a sufficient amount of corroboration. That's again in science, you need to test something again and again and again and retest it. But there's something like important. I think this is important context. In vitro experiments have shown evidence of potential antiviral properties of ivermectin when used on infected cells. Although, when used in clinical trials to treat for dengue virus infection between 2014 and 2017, the test subjects did not show improvement. Also, a paper published in 2020 exploring the possibility of clinical trials stipulated that genetic testing would be a prerequisite to screen for subjects with the mutation. So again, there's not enough information to show that ivermectin is particularly effective against COVID-19 in humans. Again, when it's in the human body, not just the cells, because that is a very important difference. And there's a ton of variables, but like that it's what, particular cells in a petri dish versus how a virus acts and behaves in the human body. It can, again, there's a lot of other things that you need to account for. And even the initial study showing that it could potentially work against COVID-19, there was not a ton of corroborating data. And I think another thing that gets missed here is most of these people, including Joe Rogan, were pitching ivermectin as an alternative treatment to COVID for those who don't want to get any of the vaccines that are available. And that is the part where the misinformation really comes into play, because we have reams and reams of data showing that, at the very least, these vaccines are more effective at reducing fatalities and severe illness than ivermectin. So if you are telling somebody that a drug that has not been thoroughly tested enough could treat you better than a vaccine upon which we have lots of data and information showing its efficacy, including from, because this got brought up too, is like kind of the how big money interests work in science, and we don't want to pretend that that does not happen. You know, there's this whole kind of liberal ethos, believe the science. It's like, well, you know, Biden administration doesn't really seem to be believing climate science when it interrupts the bottom line of fossil fuel companies, but it is important to understand that just hand-waving at this idea that, most institutions are corrupted by capitalism does not, that is not sufficient to debunk corroborating data from competing interests, mind you. There's even, we're going to be talking about the bad stuff when it comes to Pfizer's vaccine in a minute, but there is, countries and entities like, China, Cuba, etc., people who are an oppositional interest to capitalism and capitalist corporations have come out and said, yes, we've seen the same thing in our data. China accepts a lot of the American vaccines as acceptable if you want to travel to the country. There's even a point during the pandemic where the Chinese government was supplementing their vaccine supply with some of Pfizer's mRNA technology and vaccines. So just putting a fine point on it, like that is the medical misinformation. That is, again, summing up what's wrong with using ivermectin to treat it, and that is the central problem. You don't use your platform to prescribe bad medicine, and if you do, make a correction, make a retraction. Don't, it's like when you're looking for like new ideas, if you're talking about politics or history or ideology, it's like, yeah, that's fair game. But we're talking about like baseline medical information that can, really factor into whether somebody lives or dies. Then yeah, it's important to get it right and to not offer, some oppositional data that could lead people to either not getting the treatment they need or getting a treatment that could put them could be a huge hazard to their health, as we were just talking about. All right, we're going to take a quick little break. When we come back, we're going to be talking a little bit about the book, Coronavirus Criminals, by John Nichols. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org, your only source for political revolution.
Wider FM is the student-run radio station at Western Michigan University. Along with the Western Herald and Western Herald Video, Wider is part of the
Looking for new trails to explore? The Calhaven Trail is 33 miles of limestone trail connecting Kalamazoo to South Haven. It passes through many small towns and is great for those enjoying hiking, biking, running, and more. The Kalamazoo Trailhead is located on 10th Street. Enjoy the adventure.
Hello, wider listeners. Y'all are listening to Media Cyphers only on 89.1 WIDR or online at widerfm.org. You can also find our full episodes on YouTube, and we upload certain material, the best of, to our podcast on Podbean. You can find on most podcast platforms. So this next chunk of the show, we're going to be talking about a new book. Verso just put it out. It's by John Nichols, a longtime contributor to progressive magazines like The Nation. Really does really good journalism. But he just came out with a new book, and I want to spend a little bit of time talking about it on our show because it highlights some really important stuff that, again, I think the mainstream media is missing, not necessarily focusing on. And his book is called Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers, Accountability for Those Who Caused the Crisis. And the main thesis that runs through this book, it basically, the form is each chapter is a different individual or corporation that had a hand in exacerbating the pandemic. So, again, you've got chapters about, the role of people like Andrew Cuomo and his becoming like taking on this role as like pandemic hero, and then what he did with the nursing homes, or people like Ron DeSantis just completely bungling the corona response and putting profits over people. But the main through line here is the idea that there needs to be actual accountability for these crimes, and he does lay out these are real, just atrocities that these people and entities have done that exacerbated the pandemic. And what he argues overall is like there needs to be consequences for this criminal behavior. Otherwise, all of these things will really just happen again, and likely worse. He talks about the way traditionally in American history, powerful figures really have not been held accountable. Even in our own, maybe not the lifetime of people listening to the show or mine, but, remembering back to the Nixon era in Whitewater. He was pardoned, and he basically got to live out the rest of his life, quietly doing what he wanted to do, even though he was guilty of high crimes. The same goes so far for most of the people who are in the Trump administration during the COVID-19 pandemic, and for other people who are acting as profiteers and capitalizing on, a once-in-a-century crisis. And on that note, talking about profiteers, I'm going to read 2 chapters from this book that focuses on Michigan's own coronavirus criminals. And the first one we're going to talk about, and this kind of goes into some of the discussion we were just having, Pfizer. Pfizer is highlighted in the book and gets its own chapter. And I'm going to go ahead and read that chapter. But as longtime listeners know, this is something we've brought up on the show many times before, really criticizing Pfizer in particular for the way they have bogarted the vaccine, and they have not, again, they've used it as a source of profit. They have not made it accessible for poorer countries to get access to, which again does nothing but delay and prolong the pandemic and make it more and more likely that more resistant variations of COVID-19 will emerge, such as Omicron. But in this chapter, John Nichols does a really good job of describing how basically from the inception of their Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, Pfizer really had its eye on the ball when it came to how do we squeeze as much profit as possible out of this versus really what should have been the question, how do we eradicate COVID-19 as quickly as possible? So as you might imagine, If you do a really ghoulish calculus, make a little bit more money if the pandemic stretches on. So this is chapter 16 of John Nichols' book, Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers. The Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. spoke the most fundamental truth of the coronavirus pandemic 44 years before the crisis hit. We are concerned about the constant use of federal funds to support this notorious expression of segregation, King said on March 25, 1966, at the Second Convention of the Medical Committee for Human Rights. Of all the forms of inequality, injustice in health is the most shocking and the most inhumane because it often results in physical death. When COVID-19 struck, King's words were frequently recalled because the passing decades had not addressed health inequality. The Reverend William Barber II saw the truth immediately, observing in March 2020, "The moral crisis is coming to a head as the coronavirus pandemic lays bare America's deep injustices. While the virus itself does not discriminate, it is the poor and disenfranchised who will experience the most suffering and death. They're the ones who are least likely to have health care or paid sick leave, and the most likely to lose work hours. And though children appear less vulnerable to the virus than adults, America's nearly 40 million poor and low-income children are at serious risk of losing access to food, shelter, education, and housing in the economic fallout from the pandemic. The underlying disease, in other words, is poverty, which was killing nearly 700 of us every day in the world's wealthiest country long before anyone had heard of COVID-19. As the pandemic grew more severe, physicians and scientists filled in the details. The Centers for Disease Control acknowledged that long-standing systemic health and social inequities have put many people from racial and ethnic minority groups at increased risk of getting sick and dying from COVID-19. The Lancet observed that the pandemic has highlighted the equity gap in outcomes for marginalized communities, specifically the Black community, as starkly shown by the disparate morbidity and mortality from COVID-19 individuals from these communities compared with the majority white population. An Economic Policy Institute study determined that persistent racial disparities in health status, access to health care, wealth, employment, wages, housing, income, and poverty all contribute to greater susceptibility to the virus, both economically and physically. A Brookings Institute review of the data explained, the coronavirus does not discriminate, but our housing, economic, and healthcare policies do. Environmental racism, unaffordable housing, a lack of job opportunities, poverty, and inadequate healthcare are underlying social conditions, strongly influenced by policy which place Black people in their neighborhoods at risk. To flatten the curve of COVID-19 and prevent future pandemics from wreaking the same havoc, these conditions must be addressed. Surely, this was the time to address racial, social, and economic injustices that had always existed, but that were now fully exposed. Yet, through 2020 and into 2021, injustices persisted, not merely because it was difficult to undo them in short order, but because the structures that had been established for responding to healthcare challenges actually perpetuated inequalities. So it was that, a year into the pandemic, when the United States and countries around the world were racing to administer the vaccines that would save lives and restore a measure of economic and social stability, a new phrase entered the vocabulary to go along with health inequality and vaccine inequality. The international picture was jarring. In February 2021, Science magazine pinpointed a stark reality in the global response to the coronavirus pandemic. Countries in Europe, Asia, and the Americas have administered more than 175 million shots to protect people against COVID-19 since December 2020, with most countries giving priority to medical workers, the magazine reported. But not a single country in sub-Saharan Africa has started immunizations. South Africa will be the first this week, leaving healthcare workers dying in places where they are scarce to begin with. But inequality was not just evident in studies that compared wealthy and impoverished nations. It was present within wealthy nations. A racial gap has opened up in the nation's COVID-19 vaccination drive, with Black Americans in many places lagging behind whites in receiving shots, explained the Associated Press in January 2020. An early look at the 17 states and 2 cities that have released racial breakdown through January 25th found that black people in all places are getting inoculated at levels below their share of the general populations, in some cases significantly below. That is true even though they constitute an oversized percentage of the nation's healthcare workers, who were put at the front of the line for shots when the campaign began in mid-December. There are lots of explanations for the inequities, including the failure of the deliberately neglectful Trump administration to take the basic steps that were required to develop a smart and fair program for vaccination distribution in the United States, let alone the world. Much was made of the reticence of particular communities to trust vaccination programs administered by a government with an ugly history of medical experimentation without transparency and medical neglect without compassion for racial and ethnic minorities. But not much attention was given to another factor: the way the U.S. economy is rigged to benefit multinational corporations at the expense of common sense and common decency. It's not just capitalism that is a problem, although the pandemic certainly revealed a great many flaws in the theory that the market can resolve societal challenges. It's the way in which capitalism works in a country like the United States, with its cronyism, corruption, racketeering, lack of oversight, and open invitations to the sort of cozy deal-making that well serves corporations but ill serves humanity. Despite all the acknowledgements of inequality, the structures remain unchanged.
Hey, this is DJ Odorico, host of Drum the Bass, every Thursday night, 10 p.m. to midnight on 89.1 Wider FM.
So, it was that a year of pandemic profiteering gave way to the inevitable vaccine profiteering. While the early reporting on the rollout of vaccines tended to portray pharmaceutical corporations and their CEOs as heroic figures, that was always a fantasy. By and large, they were in it for the money. And one company, Pfizer, was in it for very big money. First out of the gate with a complex vaccine, Pfizer raced to cut deals with countries around the world that were desperate for doses. They were very good deals for Pfizer, which made it clear from the start of the race to find a vaccine that it intended to cash in on the pandemic. In the summer of 2020, long before anyone had gotten the jab, Pfizer CEO Albert Bourla announced that we do anticipate making a big profit on the vaccine. To those who suggested that Big Pharma should forgo big paychecks in order to address a crisis that had already taken so many lives and destabilized so much of the world, Bourla said, "You need to be very fanatic and radical to say something like that right now." Yes, putting people over profit is fanatic and radical, according to Mr. Bourla. So, going on. In fact, several pharmaceutical companies recognized a duty to forego the most egregious forms of profiteering in order to assure that vaccines got to people that needed them in the smoothest and most efficient ways possible. U.S. drug maker Johnson & Johnson, along with AstraZeneca, which is developing a coronavirus vaccine in partnership with Oxford University, have both pledged to make their vaccines available on a not-for-profit basis during the pandemic, reported The Guardian in November 2020. AstraZeneca, which is charging governments $3 to $5 a dose, also said last week that low-income countries would receive its vaccine at a cost basis in perpetuity. And here's the twist. The other vaccines, which came online shortly after Pfizer's, were easier to store and distribute. In other words, they are far better suited to a mass vaccination program that sought to get doses to people who lived in underserved urban neighborhoods and remote rural areas, who might lack the resources and options to make multiple appointments for multiple shots. But Pfizer stuck to the plan to turn an outrageous profit. How outrageous? Company estimates acknowledge that the profit per dose could be as high as 30%. But a July 2020 note to investors, SVB Leerink analyst Jeffrey Porges estimated that the company's profit margin for a vaccine could be as high as 80%. Based on a deal reached in the summer of 2020 with the U.S. government, Pfizer agreed to supply 100 million vaccination doses with an option to deliver another 500 million. The price tag for the company's two-shot course of vaccinations would be $39, or $19.50 per dose. The company would maintain that price in negotiations with other countries, said Borla, who told a July conference call, all the countries that are developed right now will not receive a lower price with the same volume commitment than the U.S. Pfizer's profit? According to The Guardian, Pfizer and the German biotech firm BioNTech stand to bring in nearly $13 billion in global sales from their coronavirus vaccine next year, which will be evenly split between the two companies, according to analysts at the U.S. investment bank Morgan Stanley. Pfizer's half would be more than the U.S. pharmaceutical group's best-selling product, a pneumonia vaccine that generated $5.8 billion last year. Of course, people in the United States and around the world welcome the sense of urgency that Pfizer and other pharmaceutical companies brought to the race to develop vaccines. Speed was of the essence, and so vital an undertaking. When vaccine breakthroughs were announced, they were widely celebrated. Most observers accepted that the drug companies would benefit financially. What they didn't count on was the fierce determination of a particular company to maximize its own profits. How did Pfizer take advantage of the pandemic? Let's turn to John A. Quelch, the Dean of the University of Miami Patty and Allen Herbert Business School and a professor in the Miller School of Medicine's Department of Public Health. Pfizer's strategy is simple, he explained in December of 2020. Be first to market and make a boatload of money by skimming the cream, supplying vaccines to those willing to pay. Pfizer has cut deals at high prices with about 20 developed countries. The government agencies can't reject the Pfizer vaccine as too expensive because they can't ask their frontline healthcare workers to wait for a cheaper alternative. They have to act now. For the Tampa Bay Times, Quelch wrote, Pfizer set out to be the first across the finish line and reap a public relations bonanza. That's why it pursued an mRNA vaccine, which can be developed and manufactured much faster than traditional vaccines. But Pfizer's vaccine has to be stored at minus 70 degrees Celsius to retain its efficacy. Developing countries do not have and cannot afford such a cold chain. That means Pfizer is off the hook to provide low or no-cost doses to billions of people in poorer nations. The Moderna vaccine, also an mRNA vaccine, was designed to require normal vaccine refrigeration at about minus 20 degrees Celsius. Note also that Pfizer declined the U.S. government's subsidies to fund its vaccine development. This preserved Pfizer's negotiating independence, avoided bureaucratic delays, and helped Pfizer get to the finish line first. Taking no subsidies enabled Pfizer to deflect any government pressure to make its vaccine available at lower cost. Savvy observers like Quelch may have been onto Pfizer, but the company kept cutting highly profitable deals. On December 23, 2020, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services and the Department of Defense announced plans to purchase an additional 100 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine from Pfizer. The deal included options for the purchase of an additional 400 million doses of the Pfizer vaccine. Sweet for Pfizer, but tough for U.S. taxpayers. The government would pay for the vaccines and distribute them free of charge to Americans at immense cost and immense inconvenience because of the requirement that the Pfizer vaccine be refrigerated at exceptionally low temperatures and distributed in 2 doses. As Quelch noted in December, Pfizer wanted to book a second big order now before the J&J results come in. In other words, Pfizer's strategy was to play on the desperation of people and policymakers for a vaccine that might slow the spread of COVID-19 and save lives. This approach was guaranteed to benefit the bottom line of what was already one of the most profitable pharmaceutical giants in the history of the world. But it was bad practice for the United States and other countries that needed to use their resources to develop and implement comprehensive plans for getting vaccines to the people who needed them most. Pfizer's strategy worked. In February 2021, the company announced that it expected to take in $15 billion from vaccine sales during the course of the year, making its products one of the highest revenue-generating drugs in the history of the world. Pfizer predicted that it expected to take in as much as $61 billion in 2021, almost $20 billion more than it had made in 2020. The COVID vaccine, an entirely new product developed as an emergency response to a crisis, would account for as much as 25% of Pfizer's profits, more than the company took in from its next 3 best-selling products combined. In May of 2021, an industry monitor, Pharmaceutical Technology, reported, Pfizer has vastly exceeded its COVID-19 vaccine sales forecast of $15 billion and now expects the jab to bring in $26 billion of revenue in 2021, an increase of 73% on previously anticipated figures, with 1.6 billion doses set to be delivered under current contracts. It's possible that even this adjusted forecast will prove to be an underestimate, with Pfizer expected to secure further lucrative supply contracts through the year. Pfizer CEO Bourla claimed the company's massive windfall was well-deserved, bragging to interviewers that the private sector found the solution for diagnostics and the private sector found the solution for therapeutics and vaccines. But Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Michael Hiltzik of the Los Angeles Times poked a great big hole in that assertion with a January 2021 assessment of how pharmaceutical companies were cashing in on the pandemic that labeled Pfizer's profits and those of another pharmaceutical giant, Moderna, a scandal. The notion that the private sector achieved all of this entirely on its own is the bedrock of the pharmaceutical industry's position that it deserves everything it can get, Hiltzik wrote. But it's wrong. None of its diagnostics, therapeutics, or vaccines would exist if the U.S. and other developed countries hadn't funded research before the companies stepped in to exploit it. The role of public funding in drug development has been an open secret for decades. Its role in developing the COVID vaccines shouldn't escape scrutiny, and the private sector should be made to pay it back. Patent and IP rights are worth billions too, and taxpayers should get their share. Pfizer's profiteering did not surprise members of the AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power, better known as ACT UP, which got its start in the 1980s when playwright Larry Kramer and other activists formed the grassroots group to engage in direct action to demand that politicians and corporations respond to the AIDS crisis. ACT UP, which remained active in New York and other cities around the world, had long focused on the nefarious role played by pharmaceutical corporations in creating the health inequality that Dr. King called out decades earlier. Years before the pandemic hit, ACT UP organized mass rallies outside the Pfizer headquarters in New York, where ACT UP activists aligned with campaigners from other health advocacy groups to deliver the message, Pfizer greed kills. At a 2016 protest, activists warned that the pharmaceutical industry's lies and continuous acts of financial greed were limiting access to treatment and costing people their lives. ACT UP assembled this prescient set of complaints. Pfizer price gouges. In January 2016, Pfizer hiked the price of over 100 medicines by up to 20%, including treatments for breast cancer, mental health, HIV, epilepsy, prostate cancer, pneumonia, skin and gut infections, acute myeloid leukemia, erectile dysfunction, menopause symptoms, diabetic peripheral neuropathy, fibromyalgia, and heart disease. These price increases deviate from costs of inflation and regularly occur over the years. 2. Pfizer lies. They claim that R&D for the medication cost over $1 billion. Their propaganda deceives the public to justify that they deserve billions of dollars in profits in order to recoup costs. Pfizer uses millions in public funds to develop drugs and needs to open its books to reveal the true R&D costs. Pfizer steals. Pfizer merged with Irish company Allergen in 2015 to permanently avoid paying up to $35 billion in U.S. taxes. This is one of the largest tax dodges ever. Pfizer extorts money from patients who cannot afford its drugs while evading taxes. Pfizer gets children killed. Pfizer has refused to negotiate with Medicines Sans Frontières to lower the price of the pneumonia vaccine to $5 per child. The vaccine can save millions of children's lives, but is too expensive for many developing countries. In 2014 alone, Pfizer made $4.4 billion from vaccine sales. We support MSF and demand Pfizer to disclose the prices they charge all countries for this vaccine. The system is not fair. We effectively pay twice for medicines while Big Pharma profits. Mark Harrington, an activist with the Treatment Action Group, explained at the time. We need a new approach to making drugs for serious and life-threatening diseases. Having the public invest in the research at the beginning and then pay again for the drugs at the end, while the profit is privatized in the middle, there is something very wrong with that model. He was right, as became all the more evident when the coronavirus pandemic hit. One of the first groups to respond to the crisis was ACT UP New York, where it renewed the message, silence equals death. The group used virtual organizing to challenge the Trump administration's lies and the failure of policymakers in general to respond to a healthcare crisis that once again hit people of color, working class communities, and the vulnerable hardest. One activist created a graphic that recalled the famous jacket worn... excuse me. One activist created a graphic that recalled the famous jacket worn by the late artist David Wojnarowicz with its message, "If I die of AIDS, forget burial, just drop my body on the steps of the FDA." The new image, overlaid on a surgical mask and sent over Twitter, read, "If I die of COVID-19, forget burial, drop my body on the steps of Mar-a-Lago." Yesterday, a friend posted that people we knew were losing people to COVID-19, and the government has blood on its hands. Jennifer Johnson Averill, the director of advocacy communications at New York's Housing Works and a former ACT UP member, told Out magazine as the pandemic ravaged the city in March 2020. I immediately thought of David Wojnarowicz's jacket and posted the line, "The federal government has already killed some of us, and we just haven't seen the body count yet. I'm angry, we're angry, and we've just begun to fight." She said the specific use of Mar-a-Lago as opposed to a government building was purposeful. ACT UP New York activists well understood that COVID-19 wasn't AIDS, but they recognized that the parallels are clear as day. They maintain that vulnerable communities are taking the brunt of the pandemic due to overwhelming neglect, and that all the barriers in place, healthcare, pharma greed, housing, stigma, etc., that have kept HIV alive will keep this virus alive. That reference to pharma greed drew on the group's experience and became the focus of its activism, and that of other health advocacy organizations that saw stark evidence of the inequality, the corruption, and the greed that killed. We've seen the same practice happen time and time again, announced ACT UP New York. The virus will disproportionately affect people living with HIV in our long-term survivor community, and we will give it our best fight to eradicate it with direct action. To that end, ACT UP New York activists conducted a Free the Vaccine campaign to demand an end to the profiteering that led to vaccine apartheid. They demonstrated outside the Pfizer headquarters in New York on March 11, 2021, alongside activists from Health Gap, Housing Works, the Center for Popular Democracy, People's Action, and other groups. If we should have learned anything from the AIDS epidemic, it's that putting profits ahead of people continues to kill and allows epidemics to spread globally, said ACT UP member Kate Barnhart. We need to stop doing that. We need to realize no CEO needs $17 million a year in compensation. We need to realize that these drugs that these companies like Pfizer are selling do not cost that much to manufacture. It's all profit. They will tell you that they need to make these profits for research, but a lot of the research is actually funded by our tax dollars. We paid to develop this vaccine. It's our tax dollars going to buy the vaccines. They're profiting off of COVID. They're profiting off of people suffering and off of people's deaths. They need to let the patents go. They need to let companies make this vaccine available globally and to those in need here in the U.S. That was a necessarily militant message, and it gained traction with honest policymakers such as Senator Bernie Sanders. It is unconscionable that amid a global public health crisis, huge multi-billion-dollar pharmaceutical companies continue to prioritize profits by protecting their monopolies and driving up prices rather than prioritizing the lives of people everywhere, including in the global south, Sanders said. Our government has invested enormous sums of taxpayer dollars in the production of these technologies. All people should benefit, not just a few already obscenely wealthy CEOs and shareholders in the wealthiest country on earth. We need a people's vaccine, not a profit vaccine. Dr. Runa Ray, a physician at one of New York's city's hardest hit hospitals, echoed that call, and Dr. King's message from more than 5 decades earlier at the rally outside Pfizer headquarters. Knowing that the people she served in the New York borough of Queens were primarily people of color and immigrants who got sicker and they died more frequently from COVID-19 than other communities, she said, "Now we're seeing with the vaccine that the same communities that were worst affected by the disease are now getting access to vaccine the least. In my 10 years of working here," she concluded, "I've seen how the American healthcare system is disproportionately racist and classist and gives disproportionate access to healthcare to those who are healthy and wealthy in often whiter communities. Now, we are here to say, as healthcare workers, that this kind of racism and inequality in healthcare, especially with COVID-19 and COVID-19 vaccines, cannot continue in our name. Pfizer and pharmaceutical companies like Pfizer cannot make profits in our name at the expense of people's health and lives." So, again, that is from the book, Coronavirus Criminals and Pandemic Profiteers by John Nichols, and that chapter was Pfizer's Vaccine Profiteering.